Hello, everyone. Very pleased to have you with us here today for our 38th, I believe, episode of This Is CDR. This Is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the wide range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals OpenAir are working on and advancing in New York and other states and jurisdictions. Everyone, please, if you haven't already, introduce yourself in the chat. My name is Toby Bryce. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy for OpenAir. Quick background on OpenAir, if you are not familiar with us, we are a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of carbon removal solutions that are essential to solving the climate crisis. Our growing global community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of policy advocacy, R&D, and CDR market development. There should be some links in the chat to join our Discord server, which is where we communicate and organize our projects. Plenty of great and fun work to do, so please take a look at that and join us. Before we get started, we always like to call out a quick definition of what we're talking about when we say carbon removal. This is the definition from the CDR primer, which is a great resource to learn about carbon removal. It's also basically the same definition used by the IPCC, but carbon removal is purposeful anthropogenic activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and to durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. When we talk about CDR as we are today and with this series, it's critical to emphasize upfront that carbon removal is in no way, shape, or form an alternative to reducing emissions. We must reduce global emissions and decarbonize the global economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, there is clear scientific consensus expressed most recently in very stark terms in the IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 report that carbon removal will be required at immense volume, at immense scale, gigaton scale, billions of tons per year by mid-century if we want to limit warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is our goal. We are currently at kiloton scale, 10, 50,000 tons per year in 2021, depending on how you're counting it and what durability level you're using. So we have a tremendous amount of work to do to get to gigaton scale by mid-century, and we have to start doing that work now. To learn more about carbon removal, there'll be a link in the chat to the past episodes of this series, and Chris Neidl, OpenAir's co-founder who's running the chat, will put some other resources in the chat, but plenty of ways to learn about carbon removal out there. And today we're gonna learn some about a very interesting ocean-based electrochemical approach. My colleague Megha Raghavan is going to hop on now to introduce today's session.
Hi everyone, I'm Megha Raghavan. I am an OpenAir member in London, and I work on some policy advocacy opportunities out in California, where I'm from. So this week, as usual, we're going to start with a 15 to 20-minute presentation, followed by a few prepared questions, which Toby will go through, and then we'll do moderated audience Q&A. So if you have any questions as we go on, please type them into Zoom's Q&A box. Just note that that's separate from the chat function, so please put them in the correct one so we can sort of manage and organize them best. We're also recording the event, so we'll send the video link out to everyone who registered. We'll also post it to OpenAir's website and to our YouTube channel if you want to find them later on. All right, so this week on This Is CDR, we're very happy to welcome Captura CEO Steve Oldham to tell us how the company employs established electrochemical concepts to remove CO2 from the atmosphere via direct ocean capture, using only seawater and renewable energy and producing no byproduct. Steve joined Captura as the CEO on the 11th of April. His prior role was the CEO of direct air capture company Carbon Engineering. Under Steve's leadership, CE made significant progress in bringing DAC into commercial reality. Highlights include raising over $100 million in equity and non-dilutive funding, raising public awareness, and advocating for DAC-specific policies in North America and the UK, concluding a major strategic partnership with Oxy for DAC deployment, negotiating the largest carbon removal commercial contract yet announced with Airbus via Oxy, and growing the CE team while building a dedicated R&D center for CE in British Columbia. CE was named North American CleanTech Company of the Year in 2021 under his leadership. Prior to CE, Steve was a senior executive in Canadian aerospace company MDA and its US parent Maxar. Steve led a variety of strategic files for McDonnell Douglas and also served as general manager for the company's robotics and satellite groups. So Steve, whenever you're ready, we'll pass it over to you to go through your presentation.
Great, thank you, and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening to everybody, wherever you may be. I'll start by sharing my screen, and then I'll jump straight in. Yeah, happy to have you here and talk a little bit about Captura and what we do and how we think the ocean can be a significant participant in addressing climate change. So let me start. There we go. Let me start at the top. I think everybody on this call will be very, very aware of the role of carbon removal, and regrettably, its increasing necessity in addressing climate. Why is Captura's approach different? So fundamentally, the challenge for atmospheric carbon removal is that CO2 in the atmosphere is very thinly dispersed at roughly 420 parts per million. So that means if you're employing technology to address carbon removal, you have to touch or move very significant amounts of air to be able to capture a meaningful quantity of CO2. So direct air capture companies do that by building air contactors, machines that physically touch the air, and they have to have absorbents to pull the CO2 out of the air. And those absorbents then have to be either replaced or regenerated. It's a perfectly good solution. Captura's approach is to say the most efficient large air contactor on the planet already exists. It's called the ocean. The ocean absorbs about 30% of all CO2 that's put into the atmosphere today. And if we can utilize that process in reverse, if we can take CO2 out of the ocean in a way that the ocean then pulls it out of the air, we basically avoid the capital cost of air contactors, we avoid the operational cost of absorbents, we avoid byproducts, and we also avoid or reduce the amount of energy required, because CO2 in the ocean is volumetrically about 150 times higher than CO2 in the atmosphere. So the approach that Captura has generated basically has no byproducts. We use simply ocean water and renewable electricity. We produce a stream of CO2. That CO2 can be sequestered to produce a carbon credit, or it can be utilized to produce something like a fuel. And we think this is very much scalable to gigaton scale, given the fact the ocean is absolutely enormous, it's available, and it's free. We are very proud and pleased to be one of the 15 milestone award winners for the X Prize. And our work has also been enabled to a large degree by our partnerships with ARPA-E and Southern California Gas, both of which have helped us with early stage funding. Captura has the exclusive license to implement and commercialize this technology from Caltech, and I'll talk a little bit about the technology as we go along. Fundamentally, this picture shows it's a taxonomy of how to address climate change. Emission reduction at source, many very, very capable and compelling point source capture technologies exist. Decarbonization solutions like electric cars. Direct air capture as a way of pulling CO2 out of the air anywhere on the planet. And then direct ocean capture in the case of Captura, where we use the ocean as the air contactor and the absorbent. Very quickly on the economics, and then I'll dive more into Captura itself. I've always been a big fan of the work that the analysts have done. This is Goldman Sachs, McKinsey have done similar things on looking at carbon abatement costs. And really, this is the way I think to address the economics of climate change. To stop every single emission at source, as shown on this graph, roughly about 50% of the world's emissions are relatively cheap or straightforward to stop at source. And so, of course, we should all be driving very hard on these solutions. But the other 50% are difficult. They're expensive. They're geographically challenging. They are feasibility challenging. They're lifestyle changing. I always use the example of aviation. How do we decarbonize aviation? By inventing electric planes, which are going to be many, many decades away, producing enough synthetic fuel to power every jet on the planet, the enormous infrastructure change required. Are we going to ban aviation? Or maybe the right answer is we don't do any of those things. We allow aviation to keep using fossil fuel, but we remove in its entirety and permanently its carbon footprint. The area under this graph is about $3 to $4 trillion per year to decarbonize at source. At Captura, we are very confident of our removal costs will be less than $100 a ton very quickly, and I'll explain why that is. So that presents an opportunity from a business perspective of a very significant total addressable market. But perhaps more interestingly, it gives all of these sectors of the economy a route to decarbonize at whatever pace makes sense. And of course, carbon removal allows you to eliminate any emission from anywhere on the planet and from any moment in time. Really pleased to see the interest and the momentum building in carbon removal. When I joined carbon engineering at the start of 2018, carbon removal was a very long way from the public conscience. I think that's changed a lot. All of these headlines came from March and April. There are many great headlines in here that reflect the interests of the finance community, the strategic energy sector, customers, and of course the progress of companies like Carbon Engineering and Climeworks. So let's get on to what Captura does. As I mentioned earlier on, the ocean absorbs about 30% of the world's CO2. The shallow ocean and the atmosphere operate in essentially an equilibrium with respect to CO2. The more CO2 we put in the air, the more the ocean absorbs. And of course, that's leading to the ocean acidification effect that leads to blanching of the coral reefs and other areas of concern for marine life. Fundamentally, we interact with the shallow ocean layer. The deep ocean layer stores carbon almost permanently on geological timescale. So working with the deep ocean layer is potentially a way to sequester, but that's not what we do. We interact with the shallow ocean layer. Most of the ocean, the shallow and the deep ocean, are separate. There's little interaction between the two. So we put Captura plants where the shallow ocean operates independent of the deep ocean. And consequently, we can utilize this equilibrium between the atmosphere and the ocean. And if we pull CO2 out of the ocean will then pull it out of the air, as long as we do it using a certain chemical approach. This block diagram describes Captura's process at a high level, and then I'll get more into the bubble of what's inside Captura's process on the next slide. So fundamentally, our intake is ocean water. Today, the ocean has a pH level of about 8.1. It was about 8.4 in the pre-industrial era. Now we're at about 8.1, so it's more acidic. That ocean water goes through Captura's electrochemical pH swing system. The only input is renewable electricity, no absorbance. The only outputs, a high purity stream of CO2 for sequestration or utilization, and decarbonized ocean water. No byproducts. The decarbonized ocean water is then taken and outflowed from the plant to the shallow ocean layer. And the shallow ocean layer then, in a period of roughly 2 weeks to 4 months, depends on where you are on the planet, will then absorb the same amount of CO2 from the atmosphere as we took out of the ocean. And that's how we achieve atmospheric removal through the medium of the ocean. Our system has no precious or rare earth elements. We think that we have considerable scalability potential. So a little bit about the technology flow here, and bear with me while I walk through this. So think of our plant as being a little like a desalination plant. We have a flow of water coming through the plant, ocean water, and as it flows through the plant, we process it. So in the bottom left here, you see us taking water out of the shallow intake. We do a high level of filtering, and then 99% of the ocean water proceeds along this bottom line on my chart here. Less than 1% goes up into a pretreatment. The pretreatment essentially takes the ocean water and converts it to salt water. So removing anything that is over and above pure salt water. That salt water then goes into the key technological enabler of this solution, which is the electrodialysis function. Electrodialysis uses bipolar membranes to dissociate the water and the salt into an acid and an alkali base. We take that acid base and we put that into the stream of ocean water as it makes its way through the plant. That acidifies that localized ocean water. And by doing so, you create a reaction which causes the CO2 to essentially bubble out. I always think of this as very similar to what happens when you open a can of Pepsi or Coke or whatever your soda of choice is, and you put it on the side and you leave it. When you leave it there, it goes flat because the CO2 that causes the fizziness ends up going back into the atmosphere again. We speed up that process using a gas liquid contactor and a vacuum pump, and that gets us our stream of CO2. And then where we are now with the stream of 99% of ocean water is it's acidic but decarbonized. So we re-add in the base, the alkali that we generated through the electrodialysis function, and that neutralizes the ocean water. And then it goes back onto the shallow ocean layer where you get this chemical reaction between the ocean and the atmosphere, and we absorb the CO2 out of the air. So how are we going to bring this technology to market? I always said when I was in CEO of Carbon Engineering, the advantage of that solution is you can put it just about anywhere on the planet. Captura, of course, has to be next to the ocean. So how are we going to roll out our technology? We're going to use the existing infrastructure that touches the ocean to the maximum extent we can. So 3 examples here: a desalination plant does filtering, pumping, and produces an outflow of brine. That outflow of brine is exactly what we need for our process. So putting a Captura plant on the back of a desalination plant, each one would capture about 10,000 tons of CO2 per year. Utilities that use ocean water for cooling, like nuclear power stations, for example, very similar opportunity. But then really interesting is the opportunity to use offshore oil and gas platforms. So an offshore oil and gas platform can house about 1 million tons of CO2 capture using our technology. And there are several thousand oil and gas platforms around the world. Many are decommissioned per year. And of course, as the energy transition gets underway, more and more of those oil and gas platforms will become redundant. They're sat on top of potential sequestration sites. So we see great opportunity in repurposing the sunk assets, the sunk costs of oil and gas platforms, and turning them into carbon removal devices. Longer term, we have this futuristic picture of what a Captura dedicated plant would look like, with renewable power available close, whether it's done like this, and then the Captura plant in the heart of it. We'll see what these long-term Captura plants look like, but we kind of like the futuristic look of this one. So what does a 1 million ton Captura system look like? Well, it's perfectly feasible. We would use, for example, water pumps. Those water pumps are existing pieces of equipment. We can get those. Electrodialysis would end up with a membrane area of about 18,000 square meters. That's a lot of electrodialysis in bipolar membranes, but there's really no integral reason why we can't scale up that industry. CO2 stripping units, we use commercial off-the-shelf products for that, and same for water filtration. So the total footprint is about 80,000 square feet for a 1 million ton plant with a weight of about 6,000 tons. So why is this approach better or lower cost? So firstly, we think we have savings in both capital and operational areas. So firstly, using the ocean as the air contactor saves a substantial amount of capital in building out air contactors, whether they are the vacuum-based approach that my friends at Climeworks use, or Carbon Engineering's mechanism of air contactors with PVC. We avoid those costs. We use the ocean. It's enormous, it's available, and it's free. Secondly, the ocean itself isn't just the air contactor, it's also the CO2 absorber. So the cost of making absorbents, regenerating them, or disposing of them, all those things are avoided. The lower energy costs per ton of captured CO2, because we move a lot less water per ton of CO2 than you have to move air to capture the commensurate amount of CO2. And lastly, and this is a really interesting feature, the electrodialysis is relatively cheap. The technology that Caltech has invented, that Captura is using, is an order of magnitude higher efficiency than the best commercial electrodialysis devices. So we can overbuild the electrodialysis. It uses about 70 to 80% of our electricity usage. So in 6 hours, we can generate enough acid and base to run the rest of the plant 24/7. So if we're using renewable electricity, we can use off-peak pricing for lower cost renewable electricity for that 6 hours for the majority of our energy use. So those 4 factors combined are the enablers of what I think is a much lower cost base. So where are we as a company? One of the other good things about the technology here, you see the electrodialyzer from the outside in our lab picture here. You can see a standard chemical bottle in the background. So we're able to build the electrodialyzers. We're able to iterate the technology, measure its performance, assess its electricity usage at very, very small scale, which allows us to very cost effectively generate this technology and improve it. So we have in the Caltech labs a end-to-end demonstration, and then we have our first 2 systems heading into the ocean water this year. So a 1-ton system, which we will install at Caltech's Marine Laboratory this summer, and then a 100-ton system, which we are already getting the parts for, which we're aiming to put with a desalination plant partner roughly early 2023. We very much want to compete for the X Prize. To do that, we need 1,000 tons of capture. So we're currently looking at how we scale that our technology to 1,000 tons. And then for large-scale deployment, I'm a very strong believer that technologies for climate need to be made available to the widest possible extent. So a licensing model where we license this technology to partners all around the world so that each of those partners can build plants in parallel and build an infrastructure for carbon removal, I think is essential. So we will do that. We will license our technology and we're ready to go with that technology licensing as quick as the market is ready to want to build our technology out. Here are some pictures of the 1-ton system in our lab here in the top left. These are the floats. So we're going to put our system, which can also, these floats can accommodate the 100-ton system. That's what we will float our technology on. And then you can see here the technology. Every day our team goes out and gets some ocean water and then brings it back to Pasadena, which isn't on the ocean. And then we feed our system with that ocean water through these various stages. Allows us to very accurately measure the performance of the system. This very system will be the one that's going into the ocean in July. So what are we working on? What are the challenges? I know enough about this sector to know that nothing is straightforward. So lots of things going on. So here are some of the questions that we're addressing. Are you sure the impact on marine life is fully understood? So fundamentally, we are not an ocean alkalinity enhancement method. Our technology is electrochemistry. We don't adjust the alkalinity of the ocean. Consequently, we believe that our technology will be very compatible with ocean health. We are working with the ocean health community already. Our friends at Ocean Visions are working with us, and we have an extensive amount of research that we plan to do to ensure that any impact, any perception of impact is addressed and mitigated to the maximum extent possible. Who will build your first commercial plant? Well, we're open to partners. With carbon engineering, we had a great relationship with Occidental, who are now building 70 million tons worth of carbon removal plants. The energy sector is definitely a candidate. The utility section is a candidate. The desalination plant sector is a candidate. Essentially, anybody who's interested in having a business line in carbon removal, we think our technology can be useful for them. So over the next 12 months, we'll be looking for licensees in the same way that we did at carbon engineering. Are you raising money? Yes, of course. The company's done a good job so far in attracting non-dilutive funding, the X Prize, our relationship with ARPA-E, Southern California Gas, but now we need to accelerate. So we are in the middle of doing a Series A right now. So anybody who's on the financial side and is interested in finding out a little bit more about our business, please don't hesitate to give me a shout. Whoops. Does the technology allow gigaton scale? I'm a very strong believer that any technology in carbon removal has to be enormously scalable. The size of the problem is huge. We can't get distracted by solutions that may look good, but simply don't scale. So the ocean, huge. Available free. The technology here, no precious metals, no rare earth elements involved, only renewable electricity, no absorbance, no byproducts to get rid of. So yes, I very much believe this is a technology that can scale to gigaton scale. What will be the lifetime of your equipment when working with saltwater? Great question. One of our key activities in the next phase of the company will be to work with the engineering community that are accustomed to the saltwater environment. At the same time, our first systems will go into the ocean. So we'll measure this. We'll figure out what the lifetime should be. At the moment, our economic model has a pretty regular replacement of certain pieces of key technology. That's all filtered into our cost model. But we'll see. We'll optimize this. How do you know the ocean will absorb the same quantity of CO2 from the atmosphere that you took from the ocean? So, there is research done for ocean alkalinity that says maybe it's an 80% relationship. We're not doing ocean alkalinity. We're doing electrochemistry. And we are very confident that the chemistry demonstrates a one-to-one mapping, but we'll work with the theorists and we'll also do demonstrations to demonstrate that is true. That's, again, something that we would like to do over the next 12 months. Where will you get your power from? It's interesting. If we're shore-based, obviously we'll plug into whatever renewable energy is available for us. For the ocean-based systems, the ocean is really an underutilized source of renewable electricity. So the combination of solar, wind, and wave power, we think gives us lots of opportunity for energy. We've already started talking to people in that sector. Fundamentally, there's been no customers for renewable electricity in the ocean. Now there is. With our technology, with the requirement and the need for carbon removal, we create a customer. So we're anticipating working closely with the renewable energy sector to generate the energy. Are you recruiting? Yes, absolutely we are. We are growing the team. We're about 7 people today. We expect to grow to 20 plus during Series A. Our website, which we're just about to update and refresh, will show our adverts. So anybody looking for a career opportunity in climate is welcome to come and talk to us. So that's a summary of Captura and everything that we're doing. Hopefully I've covered the types of things you guys are interested in hearing, and I'm happy to take whatever questions you guys have.
Thank you, Steve. Excuse me. That was fantastic. And you've clearly have a lot of experience presenting. That was really polished and excellent. We always like to start with our prepared questions, just to hear a little bit about your kind of personal and professional journey to carbon removal. You obviously came to it earlier than many. So would love to hear about that, and then maybe how you kind of arrived at this capture opportunity with an ocean-based capture method.
Sure. I mean, so, I guess the first thing I would say is I'm completely and totally unqualified for my job. I don't have a business background. I don't have an electrochemistry background or anything similar. I was a math and computer science graduate, moved into an MDA, which is Canada's space technology company, was able to move up to the executive levels of that company, doing really interesting things like the Canada arm that's on the space station, robotics for brain surgery, lots of interesting things around bringing technology to the market. I was really fortunate at Carbon Engineering. That opportunity came to me through the relationship I had with the chairman, who's now the CEO, Dan Friedman. And Dan offered me the opportunity to come work at Carbon Engineering. And just the mission was so compelling. I have to say, I didn't fully understand the scope of the climate challenge when I joined Carbon Engineering. What I found there was a company that at that stage was pretty much an R&D company, and public and policy awareness of carbon removal was almost zero. Direct air capture was perceived to be $1,000 per ton. So one of the very first things we did was we put out a third-party reviewed, peer-reviewed paper showing that our costs at Carbon Engineering would be much lower than the $1,000 a ton. My first employee that I hired at Carbon Engineering was a PR person. so that we could get the story out and we could start talking to people about the importance of carbon removal. And I think this is one of these classic sort of chicken and egg things. You can have policy around addressing climate change, but if you don't have solutions that enable that, people don't believe the policy, and that becomes a major roadblock. So for me, working on the public policy, customer, partner awareness around the technology is really important. The opportunity to join Captura was also really interesting. I saw in Captura a way to overcome some of the challenges that the direct air capture industry has. Captura has its own challenges that I've mentioned. We have to be by the ocean. We have to demonstrate this one-to-one mapping of drawdown from the air. But it's a good company and really interesting, and a company at a very similar stage that Carbon Engineering was when I joined that company in 2018. Except now, public policy, finance, customer awareness of carbon removal is just, it's night and day. It's so much larger.
Absolutely, that's great. Really appreciated all the detail that you offered on what a 1 million ton plant looks like. And you talked about, from an energetics perspective, the relative advantage to the ocean capture process to direct air capture. Is there anything that you can talk about your electricity requirements per ton or per 1 million tons? And then also I'm curious, relative to other electrochemical, I guess they're mainly ocean alkalinity enhancement pathways, are your energy requirements lower or higher? I mean, others have a HCl. Is there a cost or a benefit to having HCl as a byproduct that you have to get rid of, or a cost or a benefit to adding alkalinity to the ocean up front from an energetics perspective?
So, I think I don't think it's my place to really comment on other solutions. I go back to what I said about scalability being essential. If there are byproducts at large scale, those byproducts can become a problem, not an asset. And I think one of the advantages of our process is the lack of byproducts. From an energy perspective, we expect about 100 to 150 megawatts per 1 million ton plant. We have lots of work to do to continue improving that. We're actually, in that estimate, we're baselining a level of performance in our electrodialysis that is roughly half the performance we're getting in the lab. So we've been conservative, I think, in assessing the electrical output. It's interesting when I've talked to the ocean people who are in the business of renewable electricity from the ocean, they said, oh, that's a problem. And of course, I immediately thought, too much energy. And they said, no, it's not enough. We can build gigatons of capacity gigawatts of capacity for electricity using the ocean if only we had the customers.
Right.
So I think the renewable energy side will work out quite well, but we have to work, we'll do our bit in capture. They have to work on renewable energy provision. And then the sequestration industry also has to work in parallel and get developed as well, so we can use that.
There are a bunch of questions in the Q&A about what you will be doing with the CO2, so I'm going to leave those for Megha to kind of put together and ask you. I had a couple questions about MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. I think the carbon removal sector generally views MRV for ocean-based electrochemical approaches as an open question at this point. Can you talk a little bit about how specifically Captura thinks about MRV and how you would plan to actually deliver that to buyers of your credits?
Yeah, so, I come from the direct air capture industry, which is sort of the gold standard here. Direct air capture pulls out of the atmosphere, produces a stream of CO2. You can measure it exactly how much CO2 you captured. We're one step removed. So we can do all of that, but that's for the CO2 we took out of the ocean. So we do produce a stream of measurable CO2. A lot of the ocean alkalinity enhancement mechanisms don't produce a measurable stream of CO2. So our challenge is a little bit different. We have to demonstrate that that ton that we measured very precisely was then extracted out of the atmosphere. And I think that's going to be a combination of theory. The relationship between the ocean and the atmosphere and CO2 equilibrium is well established, but I also think we're going to have to demonstrate it. So we're in the process of working on a solution for demonstrating that at small scale. It's part of our funding plan for the next 12 months. So the aim of what we intend to do, work with the academic and ocean community to kind of get a tick in the box on the theory, and then have an experiment that will prove it. So the one-to-one mapping, and then we measure the CO2 out of the ocean, and we rely on the experimentation and the theory to say it's a one-to-one mapping. And there is a good amount of research and knowledge on the time period of this equilibrium. And I mentioned, I think when I talked about 2 weeks to 4 months is pretty standard. Depends where you are. So again, we'll put plants where it makes the most sense. And 2 weeks to 4 months later, CO2 will come out of the air.
And can you, can you in kind of high level layman's terms, can you explain your one-to-one mapping as in 2 weeks to 4 months? The paper that we had exchanged emails about, and you referenced it as the 0.8 mapping between on the drawdown, and it talks about a period of 6 months to 4 years. Can you explain in broad strokes why your process might be different from that?
So that's ocean alkalinity, where you change the ocean alkalinity. We're not doing that. We're using the bicarbonate and changing the chemistry. So it's a fundamentally different question. So there is a small amount of research done on this, but that one-to-one mapping is pretty clear. But watch this space. But you're absolutely correct. That paper, the 80% rule for ocean alkalinity changing, is probably a good rule, but that's not what we do. Okay. So we'll work on that over the next few months, and we'll be working with the experts in the field to kind of prove all that out. Sounds good.
Switching gears a bit, you referenced this on your question slide at the end, but can you talk a little bit more about specific steps that you're taking to engage with potential stakeholders, whether it's relating to potential harms and negative externalities from your process? Are you speaking with the science community with respect to marine biodiversity? How do you think about potential human communities that might be near your plants or somehow affected by your process? Can you just talk, and you have experience with this obviously from your past roles, but can you talk about how Captura thinks about these issues and kind of specific steps you might be thinking about taking as you start looking to deploy?
No, so I mean, on the ocean health side first, yes, that's absolutely what we're doing. We're fortunate to be one of the Ocean Vision's cohort of companies. So they bring expertise in terms of oceanographers to the table. We're working with them. We set up a series of things that we need to assess and research, and how we best address that. For example, we do put decarbonized ocean water out into the ocean. There will be a plume of ocean water that's decarbonized that comes out of the back of our plant. But the volume of ocean current movement, the average speed, I think, across the ocean is about 1 meter per second of ocean current. So again, you put your plants where it makes the most sense, very similar to carbon engineering's approach. You're going to put them where your ocean water will rapidly remix. And that initial plume that comes out of the back of the plant, its footprint is minimized. So yes, we are absolutely working with the science community and the ocean health community, the marine health community. We're not changing ocean alkalinity, which again is a difference in our approach. But that decarbonized ocean, we need to check what the impacts of that are going to be. With respect to sort of the wider question of potential impact of our plants, generally speaking, this is a solution that goes in remote locations. We'll be in the ocean. Where at the moment we don't have a lot of people living on the ocean. Maybe that'll change in the future, but plants that are on the shore are likely to be in existing facilities. I think it's unlikely that we would build a brand new shore-based facility for Captura, but we would use existing desalination plants, which will have permits and regulation and the like around where they're located. In general, to answer your question at a general level, in terms of sort of climate justice, I think it's one of the most important characteristics of ocean removal the wider question of that the largest contributors to climate change are the people who generated the largest amount of accumulated CO2, not necessarily the largest amount today. Carbon removal allows you to deal with yesterday's emissions. So I think it's a tool that, I'm not the policy guy, I'm not the government guy. My job is to produce tools that allow solutions. I think carbon removal is a good tool for climate justice. I think Captura's technology, no byproducts, no absorbance, just using renewable electricity, frankly, in locations where renewable electricity isn't used today, I think is a good low impact tool.
Great answer. And I appreciate you calling out those global and historical environmental justice and climate justice issue, which I think is we don't talk about enough. One last quick question, and then we have a ton of audience questions that we want to make sure we have time for. In terms of government policy, we at OpenAir are big fans of public procurement with respect to low carbon goods and carbon removal specifically. We developed a state level carbon removal procurement framework. It's a live bill in New York. And recently, very excitingly, Federal Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act was introduced. Can you talk a little bit about that policy and how you think it's helpful? Are there things that aren't in those policies that you'd like to see? Like, how do you see those affecting Captura's business?
So, yeah, great question. Utterly and completely essential. It's the very short answer. So at Carbon Engineering, I was fortunate in having a really outstanding policy team, and they were influential in helping things like the 45Q in the United States, which I think has been a major reason why so much carbon activity is now kicking off in the US. The early adopters of policy can then become models for other jurisdictions to look at and follow. We're seeing that in Canada, we're seeing it in the UK, we're seeing it in the EU now. So I think policy that drives action on commercial companies is the best tool for immediate responses. Government takes a long time to act. Commercial companies act quicker. So if you put regulation on them that requires them to achieve X, Y, Z, they're going to get on with it and move quickly. So I'm a big fan of policy that drives behavior on the commercial sector. The other policy I'm a big fan of is exactly what you just said. Government can't really stand there and tell everybody else to decarbonize and then keep generating a carbon footprint itself. So government can be an early adopter customer for carbon removal by putting carbon requirements into their procurements. The governments across the world are enormous customers. So that will create a market. It will drive down pricing because the more systems that are built, prices always come down. But it will also show this point about feasibility. I think one of the perception challenges we all face in addressing climate is the general public doesn't see a way to get it done. They don't see a way that we can eliminate emissions and get back to a sustainable climate. It's only by showing solutions at work and demonstrated impact that that perception will start to shift. So government as early adopter, I think absolutely completely in favor of that, early adopter customer, but also driving the regulation that forces industry or allows industry to see the potential of addressing climate.
Absolutely. Thank you. And hey, Megha, do you want to hop on and start asking a few of these audience questions?
Hey, yeah, sure. We have quite a few. So I'm going to start with a couple on sort of the technical side. First one is just asking, would ocean capture in general, and maybe your process specifically, work well in the Great Lakes or other lakes, or is there some kind of difference? And appreciating that, you mentioned that co-location with desalination or oil and gas rigs might be important. Is there a potential for this kind of thing on lakes, maybe with nuclear plants or purpose-built facilities? And what would be the pros and cons of doing that?
So it has to be salt water for our process. That dissociation process inside electrodialysis relies on the combination of salt and water. So, I mean, I guess you could say, would it make sense to add salt to, for example, a portion of lake water? I have no idea, but 70% of the world's surface is covered by ocean salty water. So no, I think we'll well, I know our solution will be ocean-based. Again, I can't comment on some of the other ocean alkalinity enhancement solutions, whether they can work in lakes.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Okay. And then talking specifically about what you were saying about oil and gas platforms, I think this was on your slide, but someone asked, why do those platforms have the ability to sequester 10x the amount of carbon as the other infrastructure you mentioned? What's the difference there?
Just physical size. So a desalination plant exists. The largest desalination plants have a certain flow of water. That's just their characteristic. That's what they do. And that flow of water would generate a certain amount of CO2 capture because there's only a certain amount of CO2 in that water. On a platform, it's really just space constraints. So how much equipment for carbon removal can you place on the platform? So our estimates, we've gone through and kind of looked at typical, areas and sizes of pieces of equipment. And yeah, that's why we think we can put 1 million tons on. So it's fundamentally the fact that you're building this new and you're space constrained here, whereas on a desalination plant, you're taking the flow of water as is. You're not building that flow of water from scratch.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, we got a couple of questions about things like membranes and other sort of filters, things that go into the system. So I know you mentioned, obviously, there's no like real byproducts of the process itself, but with those kinds of things that might have a limited lifetime or need to be disposed of, can you just talk through what those elements are? And I know you said you're not necessarily sure about the lifetime, but how do you think about kind of that in the topics of scaling and sort of waste or outputs?
Yeah, so we have a pretty healthy replacements budget in our techno-economic analysis. So really 2 areas. Number 1, of course, is the filters. So the filters that are filtering out, for example, marine life and algae, yeah, just like the filters in your dishwasher, not your dishwasher, your dry cleaner, they also need to be replaced. So yes, absolutely. Of course, again, that's an existing sector. The desalination industry does that all the time. The other area of lifetime assessment for us is the bipolar membranes themselves. So that is a high area of focus for us, is assessing and improving the lifetime of the bipolar membranes. We have a trade between using smaller bipolar membranes, which will likely have a longer life, or larger bipolar membranes with a shorter life. And that trade is something that, again, we'll be working with the engineering community over the next 12 months, as well as doing our R&D. So something we're very aware of, but we built a lot of this into our techno-economic analysis, and I'm kind of hopeful that we'll do better than our techno-economic analysis says in terms of cost.
Yeah, totally makes sense. We got a few questions, as I think Toby said, in terms of just what happens to the output of the CO2. And I know you mentioned like depleted oil and gas fields as one option. You also mentioned fuels at one point. Where are you in kind of thinking through where the CO2 ends up, and how much are you kind of deciding that versus, is that determined by people down the line who deal with the sequestration side?
Sure. So, I guess kind of 2 thoughts on this. The first is that we're going to be a carbon capture company. If we can be one of the best companies in the world in doing that from the ocean, that's a really useful piece in the climate jigsaw. So that's what we're going to focus on. I have no interest in becoming a sequestration company or generating synthetic fuels. There's really good companies out there doing that right now. So we'll stay focused on being a source of CO2. Then, we'll work with the rest of the community around usage of CO2. We're all familiar with synthetic fuel generation. I think we're going to see significant scaling of the industry around sequestration. The funding the US government, for example, is putting in, the EU is looking at this, the UK is looking at this. Companies like Oxy are working on, Equinor in Norway are looking at offshore sequestration. So my working assumption is, as we generate what we hope is one of the best carbon removal technologies in the world, that market is going to come along and want CO2. And certainly when I've talked to end customers of carbon credits, one of the big problems at the moment is a lack of supply. So I think we can help with that. But yes, we're part of the infrastructure. We're not the whole infrastructure. We want to use those partners.
Okay, totally makes sense. And I guess maybe this answers that question, but when you talk about $100 per ton as the cost, that includes basically the capture side of it, right? Like typically those kind of cost estimates would not include the sequestration, if I understand right?
No, we're including sequestration. So it's
Okay,
life
great.
cycle cost, energy, capture, all those things.
Okay, amazing, great. Someone asked, and maybe you don't know the answer to this, but would you have any idea of the cost of the kinds of fuels that would be generated by, down the line from Capture a solution, and whether that's economically competitive versus other fuels, if that's one of the potential use cases?
I think it is one of the use cases, as much as anything, because public interest in synthetic fuels is significant as a way of replacing fossil fuels. We need liquid fuels. We have lots of machines that use liquid fuels around the world. So I think it's very desirable that we have a synthetic fuel industry. The challenge of that industry is always going to be that it's more costly than using a fossil fuel. So the advantage of using atmospheric CO2 is that is the lowest carbon intensity synthetic fuel you can get, because it came out of the air in advance. So when you burn it, all you've done is your CI is basically zero, plus or minus details, of course. So I do think it's a viable industry because the public wants to see it, but I don't think it will ever be cheaper than fossil fuels, just because fossil fuels are pre-made and we have a sunk architecture for infrastructure for pulling them out of the ground. It's hard to compete with that. So our CO2 for sure can be useful in that field. I think we will be low cost, and we are negative emission CO2. So I think we can be a feedstock for the synthetic fuel industry for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then we had a couple of questions on the commercial side. So how is Captura going to generate revenue? Is it, carbon removal credits? I think you mentioned something about licensing as well. What's the path forward out there?
Yeah, so our fundamental approach is our technology, as I hope I made really clear. If you're not scalable, it's not worth doing, to be blunt. So we think our technology is very scalable, so our business model needs to be scalable too. We can't become a bottleneck. So licensing the technology so that lots of people can build these plants in parallel, we think is the key towards a scalable business model, a fast scalable business model, which is unfortunately what the world needs. So that's the way we want to go. So our partners would finance the plants, they would operate them, they would presumably get their revenue from either selling the CO2 or sequestering it and generating carbon credits, whatever they think the best business model is in their geography and their sector. And then Captura would take a percentage of revenue as a royalty. Same way that Intel chips in PCs get a percentage of royalties. So that's how we would make our money. The other advantage of that business model, as well as scalability, is it allows us to concentrate on doing what hopefully we do best, which is improving our technology, optimizing it. We don't need to become experts in building plants in the ocean, in permitting, sequestering. Other people can do all of that. So we'll focus on making our technology one of the best in the world for carbon removal.
Great. I'm just going to finish with one last question before I hand it back over to Toby to close us out. I know you talked a little bit about some policy, but what kind of policies or changes in the regulatory environment are most important to helping Captura move forward, scale, succeed over the next several years?
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned, I think 45Q in the US has been very influential. So we're hoping to see the enhanced 45Q that's been proposed make its way into law. We hope to see programs like California's LCFS look at direct air ocean capture as a viable and acceptable form of credits. So working really on the policy instruments that exist at the moment and putting our solution as eligible into those, and then things like government policy around purchasing, I think it's a great thing to be pushing on. My macro view of the world is that companies and governments worldwide are now saying, okay, we know we got to do this climate change thing. How the heck are we going to do it? And they're looking for policies and solutions. So being visible, driving our technology so that it's out in the market, so that it can feature in the policy as people start to plan for what they're going to do. That's a high priority for us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve. That's been amazing. I'm just going to hand us back to Toby to talk about what's coming up. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Megha. And Steve, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your expertise. It was very exciting to learn more about Captura, and we wish you all of the success in your next steps with the fundraising and everything else, and look forward to staying in touch and keeping an eye on what you guys are getting up to. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Quick few programming notes before we close. Oh, actually, a merch note. We have a new merch drop this morning. OpenAir's been making some very cool T-shirts, and this is a T-shirt to a tribute to an inanimate CDR All-Star Basalt. And there should be a link in the chat to those, but those are, I think, very attractive and could be great summer wear for everyone. We also have a new episode drop as of this morning of another OpenAir program called Horizons, which is investigating carbon removal methods and solutions that are on the horizon, or on the further away from commercialization, which is what we focus on This Is CDR. And this one is harnessing crops to durably fix carbon. It's plant-based carbon sequestration approaches with Dr. Wolfgang Busch, who is at the Salk Institute in Southern California. And this is an excellent episode, and should be a link in the chat to check it out. On This Is CDR, we are super excited next week to have Dr. Zeke Hausfather from Frontier Climate. He's going to tell us a little bit about Frontier, which I think we've all heard quite a bit about. And I'm also super excited to hear his thoughts on what he calls the brutal math of carbon removal. He's really an expert on thinking through the numbers behind the immense task ahead of us. And so look forward to hearing about that from Zeke next week. Other sessions coming up, we have Solitaire, which is a Finnish direct air capture company that integrates with building HVAC systems on the 28th. And we can also talk about Finland's very exciting net negative governmental commitment that was just announced. We're going to take a break for the holiday, the US holiday on July 5th. July 12th, we have Seafields, which is another Ocean Vision's launchpad company that's focused on open sea cultivation of macroalgae and then carbon sequestration using that. And then on the 19th, we have Ion Carbon, which is a New Jersey-based company, a recent straight purchase that is commercializing enhanced rock weathering, grinding up basalt and applying it to agricultural fields. And then on the 26th of July, we have Climate Robotics, which is a recent Microsoft purchase of carbon removal. It's basically mechanizing in situ biochar production at the field level. So it's very interesting. And the CEO, Jason Auerbach, is going to be with us. A couple of great, interesting sessions coming up in August as well. Carbion, which is another X Prize milestone awardee direct air capture company out of the Netherlands. CarboFX, which is biochar from Finland, and several more that we'll be announcing shortly. But thank you all for being with us. Thank you again, Steve, for your time today. It was a fantastic presentation, and I was super excited to see what comes next for Captura. Everyone be well, and we will see you next week.